Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Intimate is its approach. We now seek to hear the voices that are rarely heard in traditional accounts, but you included them way back when. During a Q&A later, perhaps your listeners will inquire about the depth of sourcing that has allowed for this coherence, and considering purchasing a paperback in the back at the end of the talk that perhaps you would sign? Mm-hmm. There's an eager one back there. To assist both our first-timers and regulars to quickly regain a historical context for the evening's talk, let's remember that noted historian Mary Beth Norton calls this period the long year of 1774, from the destruction of the tea to the events of April 1775. Previously, I have asked you to forget what you know about the outcome and to try to imagine the tension and suspicion of others that summer. Mary Fuhrer, who is with us this evening, has twice helped us to grasp that we are then in a hierarchical and patriarchal society. Our concerns are rural, and our town is paramount to our sense of self. We would have known where we stood and what we owed to it. Links to the previous talks can be found at Acton 250 events. Professor Gross titled the last chapter of his book, A Bridge to the Future. For the Acton 250 committee and our speakers thus far, this phrase encapsulates the unanticipated pleasure we have felt in the reliable presence of a large contingent of AB students each evening, primarily right over here. Not only have these high school students had a meaningful exposure to an explanation of why this era deserves their attention and understanding, but one of their own has taken the initiative to focus his Eagle project on a scavenger hunt for AB's 5th grade. So impressive that the staff and the administration is incorporating it into the curriculum. It is our hope that they will pass on an understanding of this consequential period, as previous generations did for those of us who were present in 1975. My friends and contemporaries, primarily on this side of the room, often say, "Why wasn't I taught this?" Who better to answer their question and reframe the narrative than Professor Gross? Lean in, forget what you think you know, and be open to new interpretations, as he will undoubtedly explain how those in our local area resisted what they believed to be threats to traditional rights of self-government. How appropriate that we are meeting in a room that used to house the Acton Town Meeting. May I hear a warm welcome for Professor Gross.
Thank you so much for that incredibly well-informed and generous introduction. I'm getting playback here. Can you all hear me? Great, well, there we go again. We're just going to try one more time. Hello, hello, hello. Well, tech person, what do I do? Okay. I think we'll rewind. Okay, so thank you so much for having me here. I have been rethinking what I wrote in the Minutemen in their world, not just for the 250th, probably ever since the day it came out. It's now nearly 50 years since the book was published, and I feel on these occasions like one of the grizzled old veterans of the Revolution at the Jubilee in 1825, coming back to rehearse the same story over and over. But if you listen closely, it's not entirely the same old story. But I will take you back to 1974, 75, when I conceived the idea for the Minutemen and their world. As I saw it in my hippie-ish, leftist, anti-war, anti-Vietnam War sensibility, too much of American history was the story of dead white men, and especially its military history. And I thought, well, I'd do something different. And I was part of a movement at the time called the New Social History, or History from the Bottom Up, a history that meant to include all the people whose voices had been left out: working men and women, common dirt farmers, blacks enslaved and free, native peoples, ordinary day laborers who shifted about from place to place. How could we put them into the story of New England's history? And how could we put them into the story of the coming of the Revolution? So much of that story was, and still is, told as a military story of battles in which you're almost inevitably going to be led to talk about the political leaders and the generals and majors and captains who are at the helm, when in fact you can also be telling the stories of common folk, white and black, who were in the rank and file in all those battles. So that was the idea, that I would tell the story from the bottom up of the coming of the Revolution. And I thought it would be nice to do it as a community study, take one place and ask a question that not many people had asked. People had studied the Revolution in Acton and Concord and Lexington, but more as if it happened in these places. But not why those places, why not other places? How might we understand what the Revolution came to mean, how it was affected by the ongoing dynamics of social life in those communities? You know, there was that old line that I suspect you all know, the jibe of Concord, of Acton's feeling about Concord's dominating the story, which was, well, Concord provided the place, but Acton the men. Well, my idea was actually to do a community study and put the place and the men and the women together. And so, if I did that, I thought, we already know the political story. What will be new about my project will be the social history. So I wouldn't really have to do much research in the politics of the town. Boy, was I wrong. So I thought I would look at the minutes of town meetings and look at the resolutions the townspeople had passed, and I'd write them up. And I assumed from the prominence of the Minutemen in Acton and Concord that these towns have been incredibly rapid to see the dangers of British taxes and enforcement measures. And so almost from the start, I assume, they had stood up and said, not for us. And with that belief, I went to the Concord Library, asked to see the minutes of town meetings. They showed me the transcripts. And I had read that Concord passed resolutions against the Stamp Act in 1765. So I go look at the town meeting book in October of 1765. There's nothing there. Except I read that the town passed a resolution and ordered the town clerk to put the resolution in the town minute book. He didn't do it. I was so anxious about this that I said, could I see the original instead of the transcript? Maybe the transcribers missed it. So I looked at the original, not there. And then I started going through things. So Concord had sent a representative to the legislature, a man named Charles Prescott, who the Boston Radicals said was a no friend to liberty. And it urged people in the newspapers to vote him out of office in 1766. Instead, Concord voted him back into office, though in other towns, the Friends of the Stamp Act got thrown out. And so it went time and again and time and again. When I was looking for Concord's militancy, I found if it did act, often it delayed action, waited till something was long over, or it got resolutions from the Boston Committee of Correspondence and watered them down. Not until the summer of 1774 did Concord finally erupt in a kind of radicalism that would carry it into the mobilization against Britain and the battle at the North Bridge. Now, when I did this, in the pre-internet age that those of you on this side of the room cannot imagine, when I did it, I didn't think to compare Concord to a lot of other towns. I probably should have. But over the years, I have now dipped into other towns' records. And what I discovered is Lexington was ferocious in its militancy, starting in 1765 with the Stamp Act and continuing unwaveringly militant down to the battle. So was Westford. So then, in preparation for this talk, I thought, well, given Acton's resentment of Concord's precedents on April 19, 1775, surely Acton must have been way out there ahead of everyone else. What do you think? Not so much. In fact, Acton was disengaged from provincial affairs. Maybe to save money, the town of Acton did not send a representative to the legislature between 1764 and 1767. 1 year, 1768, it did so, and then it returned in 1769 to 1773. No one represented Acton in the legislature. In fact, Acton did send a delegate to a convention in Boston in 1768 to protest the stationing of British troops in Boston. And in 1770, it endorsed a boycott of British goods that the merchants of Boston and the Sons of Liberty were promoting all over the colony. So it wasn't unaware of what was going on, but only in those couple of years. And then in 1773, it protested British infringements on colonial liberties by saying that they had the tendency to lead to abject slavery for the colonists. So from time to time, Acton stood up, expressed a voice. But it didn't say anything about the Tea Party in Boston until 3 months after the event. That was probably not all that helpful. So what we can say, and then when it came to raising a Minuteman Company in Acton, it dithered and dithered about it, and not until January of 1775 did it finally enlist a company. Not a lot of time to prepare for April 19th. So what's going on here? Why did it take so long for some places and not for others? How can we possibly understand why, especially, it was in the summer of 1774 that Massachusetts towns erupted and made a revolution? Well, how do we understand the town's responses to British policies? I would suggest that it's not just what you say and do, but it's when and how you say and do it. So I've already indicated then that sometimes Acton or Concord was really slow to respond, and while other places were out in the forefront of mobilization. So that's one thing. But the other is, you may not like bridge taxes, you may not like the enforcement measures, but how do you object to them? Well, one way to object is to say, these taxes are a real burden on trade. They're an economic killer of our local trade. And so you marshal all the arguments about why the taxes will lead to a recession or a depression, and why and how they will reduce the income and livelihood of farmers and traders and merchants all over Massachusetts. Or you could say, no taxation without representation. It's unconstitutional in the British scheme of things to tax us without our consent. To do so violates the rights of Massachusetts guaranteed in the Charter of 1691 by King William and Queen Mary. So you could say that. Well, arguing that the Stamp Act or the Sugar Act or the Townshend duties are killers economically, or maintaining that they're unconstitutional, those are arguments that could appeal to moderates and to militants. It didn't, and to patriots and to people who might become loyalists. But there was one kind of argument that was sure sign, so far as I've seen it, of real militancy. And that's what I call the appeal to the ancestors. And in this framing of the issue, people in Lexington and elsewhere would say, our forefathers fled oppression by Archbishop Laud and King Charles I in the 1630s. They were in quest of civil and religious liberty. And we had to flee, make the dangerous Atlantic crossing in the 1630s and 1640s, make our way through the wilderness, struggle against the native peoples, and finally carve out farms and a livelihood and homes and establish for ourselves a liberty that they could pass on to their posterity. And we, having inherited that treasure of liberty, have the obligation to preserve it intact and pass it on to the next generation. If we fail to do so, we will be defaulting on our sacred duty to maintain the world of our forefathers. Now, that was quite a remarkable thing to say. And here is how the Suffolk County Convention in Boston, in Milton, Massachusetts, in September of 1774, here's how they put the matter. Whereas the power, but not the justice, the vengeance, but not the wisdom of Great Britain, which of old persecuted, scourged, and exiled our fugitive parents from their native shores, whereas though that vengeance now pursues us, their guiltless children with unrelenting severity. And whereas this then savage and uncultivated desert was purchased by the toil and treasure, or acquired by the valor and blood of these our venerable progenitors, who bequeathed to us the dear-bought inheritance, who consigned it to our care and protection. The most sacred obligations are upon us to transmit the glorious purchase, unfettered by power, unclogged with shackles, to our innocent and beloved offspring. That was one sentence. If anybody still diagrams sentences on the board, it would take weeks, I think, to figure out the grammar. But think about that language, of how much it was a sacred duty and how much the liberties for which they claimed to be fighting were an ancestral inheritance. It's as if Massachusetts liberty was based on genealogical privilege. In some ways, it's powerful as a statement because it suggests how the very nationalism of New England, of Massachusetts Bay, rested upon a felt memory of generation after generation after generation on the land, running governments. And yet, in another sense, can you imagine who might object to this framing of the issue? The sons and daughters of Africa, whose parents and grandparents had been seized from Africa, made to cross the Atlantic through the notorious Middle Passage, taken not through a wilderness, but maybe forced into a wilderness to clear land for plantations in which they were forced to labor. So that the inheritance theme is both positive as a grounding of Massachusetts' identity, but also could be problematic for people who didn't descend directly from that ancient stock. What we then see is a complexity. The very sense of ties the people of Massachusetts had to one another could both bond them together in the struggle against Britain, but at the same time exclude others who had as strong or stronger claims to liberty. Okay, so you've got a rhetoric of inheritance that's crucial to mobilizing people to resist Britain. And you've got these economic and constitutional arguments. But that's not alone going to get you into resistance and revolution. There's something else. You've got to be able to connect the dots. Why is Britain doing what it's doing to us? They would have asked. Why is our royal government oppressing us? Well, when they connected the dots, they were saying, we thought they didn't understand us. We thought that their officials were giving, in Boston, were giving false reports about us to the King and Parliament. But actually, we've come to realize that many of the King's ministers are corrupt and self-serving and want to rip off Massachusetts in America and take what they can get and put it in their own pockets. This is a conspiracy against liberty. And we have to stop that conspiracy. And yet, there's one other thing. They weren't ready in opposing the conspiracy to say that they were ready to reject the king. So in many of their statements, they reject British measures, they denounce them as unconstitutional, they condemn the king's ministers, and then they say, but we are loyal to our sovereign, George III, and will risk our lives in his defense. So you've got a whole lot of arguments. You are now ready to resist because you've been able to connect the dots and see a conspiracy. But then why in the summer of 1774 does all hell break loose? That's the key question, and that turns out to be the link between a social history of Massachusetts and Concord and Acton and a political history of the coming of the Revolution. So as I heard Pam just say in the introduction, Mary Schur's talk had given you a sense of something of the society and culture of Acton on the eve of the Revolution. And that's crucial to know because a revolution is not just about people protesting measures by the imperial government that they don't like, and not just about asserting their interests and making plain their grievances. It's also about attitudes toward authority, your willingness, in fact, to reject the constituted authority and take up government on your own. But to unsettle authority goes to the heart of the political and social order. John Adams, when he was worrying about the development of the revolutionary movement, was concerned, he said, that he'd heard that apprentices were breaking their contracts with their masters because they heard the cry for liberty. The blacks were challenging slavery. And worst of all, he told Abigail Adams, and women are demanding their rights too. So revolutions unsettle authority. And that was a problem in Acton and Concord with their communitarian cultures, whose values and beliefs were pretty much at odds with modern democracy as we see it. Though our own seeing of modern democracy is these days itself unsettled. So how do we understand the culture in which the revolution is going to take place? Well, it's hierarchical, it's traditional, it's patriarchal. This is a world in which people are supposed to know their place and take their place. It's at once, as I said, hierarchical and inclusive. And what that means is that people were expected to respect their elders. Now, I noticed you all came in, found your places. Did anybody tell you where to sit? How did you take your seat in here? Did you just sit anywhere you wanted? Yes, come on. Yeah. Well, how did you choose your seats? Did anybody tell you? Was there a seating plan? I'm new here, so I don't know. Or did you just sit where you, who sat where they wanted? Oh, okay. And then on this side, the elders, did you sit where you wanted? Well, what if Pam had told you where to sit? Would you just listen? Well, in fact, they had a practice in Massachusetts town of seating the meeting house, in which a town committee was elected to establish a criteria by which people were to sit in the meeting house every Sabbath. And the interesting thing is in Concord, and I expect in Acton, they went by age, and then by social service, and then by wealth. So everybody in the front who was over 80 got to sit in front on the main floor. And then, after all the 80-year-olds, they could sit higgledy-piggledy. But then the 7-year-olds, the rich 7-year-olds were seated first, then the middling 7-year-olds, and then the poor 7-year-olds. And then the rich 60-year-olds, and so forth. Men on one side, women on the other. And the young people, which meant under 40, they had to walk upstairs. Black people did not have an assigned seat. They sat on the margins of the galleries, out of sight, but not out of place entirely. So you have a world in which people are expected to respect their elders. So often, sons of selectmen became selectmen in turn. They were people of middle age, usually from the top fifth of the economic structure. So you have this world that's also patriarchal, where the family was seen as a little commonwealth, where authority relations in the society at large were first learned within the household, of which the father was the head. Women subordinate, as well as the apprentices or farm laborers and the children of the family. And this authority was secured by possession of land. If you were a young man coming of age, you might resent your father's domination. You might think the worst thing going was the way he made you out there shoveling the manure. Or doing other farm tasks. And you're now 23, 24 years old, and you're still working on your father's farm, and you want to get free. Why are you going to stay? Why don't you move away? He's got land to give to you. Or he can negotiate a good marriage for you if you're the daughter. And so, land and its transmission and possession are at the core of the family. And the family line is what matters most of all. Yankee parents name their children for themselves and then their own parents in turn. Same names over and over again. Making it often hard to figure out what's going on when you read the town records, who is which John Davis when you're looking at a town. But what really has always brought home to me the kind of world it is in terms of family is how they replaced the names of children. So my wife and I have 3 children, now adults, and when our son Matt, the firstborn, arrived, he lived happily on, he's now 50, but had he died, and then his brother came along, if we had replaced the name and we called the next child Matt after the first one, would any of you find that problematic? How about if you knew that the longer the child who died had actually lived, the more likely it would be that we would name the next child in honor? Would anybody find that troubling? What do you think? No one would?
As a student of history,
No, as a person. If I were to just say to you, hi, I'm Bob. My brother Bob, he got to 15 and he died. My parents were really sad, and so I carry his name. And how many of you high school students would welcome that opportunity? Would any of you think that's really icky? Thank you. So, but that's a way by which we can measure the distance of their world from our own. They thought that was acceptable because what they wanted to do was to preserve the family line. Now, The other aspect of this world I want to bring out to you is that their political culture put a great stress on unity and consensus. Nothing made the town clerk happier than to write in the minute book that an article on the warrant passed unanimously, without opposition. That was great. Nobody thought it was acceptable to run for office. That would be showing ambition when you should be aiming to serve the community. Political parties were condemned as factions, organizations of people gathered together against the common good. So consensus, unity, no contested elections, and a common saying that summed it up as, where there is discord, there's every evil work. So, how do you organize for a revolution in a community in which consensus is the norm, unity the goal to be obtained, families the most important thing to sustain? You would think in such a world that people protesting the fatherly king of Britain might well want to preserve authority and maintain their own position as fathers of their own kingdoms in Acton. And yet, you get a revolution. How did that happen? So I don't have time to lay out the whole story. For that, you have to buy the Minutemen and their world. But let me just say quickly that on the eve of the 1770s, Concord was far from achieving the ideals that it upheld from the pulpit and from the bench of the selectmen and from the courthouse. It was far from achieving those ideals. In fact, it was falling away from them, caught up in conflict among neighbors in ways that will be familiar, I think, to many of you. First, as people moved out from Concord Center and formed new settlements in the course of the 18th century, they built up new communities and resented having to go to the center of Concord for Sabbath services on Sunday mornings, or to send their children to school, or to have to come to town meeting. And town meetings were held in March, which is mud season in Massachusetts. So if you lived in the center, you could pretty easily dominate town meetings when you're electing officers at the annual March meeting. So people were really upset. They began demanding to become a town of their own. So Bedford secedes from Concord, and Acton secedes, and Lincoln secedes. And on the eve of the Revolution, Carlisle is demanding to be able to hire a minister of its own and to raise its own militia company and to have its own meeting house. And so instead of where there is discord, there's every evil work, there was every evil work in Concord. Likewise, the church, far from being an instrument of harmony and peace, was riddled with conflict as the members refused to admit the richest landholder in town to be a fellow member of the church. They said he oppressed the widows and orphans when he was appointed to administer probate estates. And he was furious, and he starts to organize his own political party to challenge the minister, tarnish his reputation in the newspapers. It was said that the minister had taken young Phoebe Bliss in courting on a trip unescorted to Maine, a hive of immorality. And so the church is full of conflict instead of everybody just taking their seats and obeying. The town meeting is full of conflict. And worst of all, families are in turmoil because by the 1770s, population had grown generation by generation. And now there were too many young men waiting to come of age. and not enough land for all. And so families began to prepare for that eventuality by speculating in lands to the west, in Worcester County and then in northern Middlesex, and up the cattle trail into New Hampshire and into Vermont. But when the sons and some daughters began to leave, their departures unraveled the family arrangements by which young men worked on the farm till the fathers were willing to surrender land to them. Young men and young women had always had reasons as they came of age to want to form marriages as soon as possible, experience their adult lives physically as well as socially. This was akin to, if those of you who remember the first Star Wars film, came out in 1976, Luke Skywalker hated having to be on Tatooine working for his uncle. He dreamed of leaving that benighted planet to go off and be a jet fighter pilot. That's how young people must have felt in Concord and Acton on the eve of the revolution. It's said today, and the real problem in the Boston area, you can grow up in Concord or Acton or Sudbury, but you can't afford to come back here and live as an adult. In effect, you could say, that was the problem many families had in Concord in the 1770s. Their kids would not be able to stay, and they'd have to move away. And when they moved away, they had to take a risk. They might not get a place in another town, and they might become part of the wandering poor, floating from place to place without any place to land. Or the pressure on land led to growing inequality, and a number of people would be losers in the quest for land. And then, in this concatenation of problems, you can see that Concord was on the verge of losing hold of its traditional life. The most striking evidence of this is a sudden rise in the 1750s and 60s and 70s of premarital pregnancies, of brides who were with child at the marriage altar. As many as 4 out of 10 marriages made in the 1760s and 70s, the bride was pregnant. That was the means by which to get fathers to agree to marriages when they really wanted the sons to wait and stay on the farm one more season, and one more season after that. So in that setting, family authority is eroding. And one commentator said, remarked that all families were in disunion. The crowning blow came in the summer of 1774, when news came from Britain of the passage of the Massachusetts Government Act. That law, meant to punish Boston for the Tea Party, took away most of the powers of self-government. The Council of Massachusetts had been nominated and chosen by the elected House of Representatives. After the passage of the Massachusetts Government Act, no more. Thereafter, the king would name the councilors. The judges, the juries, the sheriffs, the justices of the peace, all would be named by and paid by the crown. And most importantly, local autonomy was undercut severely. The town meeting was the source of authority, the mechanism by which every community ran its own affairs. But the Massachusetts Government Act barred towns from meeting more than once a year, and that once a year was just to elect the municipal officers. And that was it. And if they wanted to have another meeting, the governor would have to approve their agenda in advance. In that setting, people saw that they were losing control politically of their own lives. But in every other way I've just described you, they were losing control of their own lives. In the church, in town meeting, in the family, in the economy. In effect, the Massachusetts Government Act came to symbolize all the ways in which it looked like life was getting out of control. They couldn't manage their own affairs. Britain became at once the cause and the symbol of a society and a political system in disarray. And the only way to preserve the legacy of the ancestors, the sacred duty among generations, only way to do so was to resist. So what I'm suggesting to you is that Acton and Concord and Massachusetts rebelled against Britain, not because of the universalist Enlightenment ideals of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. They rebelled for something narrower and more New Englandly, to preserve a social order that was not so equal, but profoundly meaningful as a very badge and ingredient of your identity. There are a lot of complications to this story, but I'll leave them to the questions. So just think, are you part of that family or not? Do you want to be part of it when you commemorate the 250th? Thank you.
So do we have questions? Mr. Trimble will come to you.
And those of you in high school, I will give you extra credit for your question. I will overcome the extra credit scam and help you get, double and triple points.
Should I go?
We have a question here, Bob.
Hi.
Hi.
And thank you. I've read your book, and it's great.
Thank you.
As I've studied, the competition between Lexington and Concord in commemorating many of these events is quite extensive. And can you hear me?
Yep.
Better? Okay. The competition between Lexington and Concord is quite extensive as to who is more contributory, et cetera. And in reading your book, I found it fascinating that really Concord played such a pivotal role in so many things that were not taught. And yet to this day, they housed Harvard, they housed so many people that were displaced out of Boston, the convention, the Constitution, being the capital, et cetera, so many things that they wanted to do. Why do you think to this day, though, they're not given more kudos?
I think we should give you an honorary vote in town meeting in Concord. A true child of Acton would surely rise up and protest against this overdue credit that Concord is getting here. But I think that something that's implicit in what I was saying. So Concord did not rush to the front ranks of revolution the way Lexington did. It took its time. But in fact, its moderation was actually an advantage. If you were in the provincial Congress aiming to mobilize against Britain, do you want to rely upon the farmers of Worcester County who were demanding that you immediately launch an attack on the Redcoats in Boston? Or would you rather trust the more measured, steady hands of Concord and Acton and a number of other towns? The moderation might actually be what you'd be looking for in a military and political leadership. So that, and there's a further thing. Mary Fuhrer has put together tables looking at the wealth of Concord and Lexington and Acton and others. Concord's, the value of its property, real estate, was actually just a little above the average in Middlesex County. So Concord in some ways was surprisingly a representative town. And in being representative, it could play this leading role. Now, I'll add quickly one thing. After the Revolution, after the War of Independence, Concord was eager to take advantage of the discontent with Boston after the suppression of Shays' Rebellion. And it campaigned to be named the capital of Massachusetts. Think of our charming little town with all those huge government buildings now. But they campaigned, and Boston kept bad-mouthing Concord because it didn't want to lose being the capital. So, in addition, in the 1790s, when Lexington was campaigning for state money for a monument, Concord wanted it too, but people said, oh no, don't give it to Concord. It will revive the idea that they'll be the capital. So there's a lot of intertown competition for credit. But I don't think there are that many people in Concord who are overly modest about the town's role. Yeah.
Well, sorry. There was, of course, the assemblies in Concord, as in the one a couple of weeks ago, or last week, wasn't it?
Yep.
But I'd be curious as to your perspective on the current political moment as it relates to the events 250 years ago, and parallels or not.
Yeah. I hope you might have been prompted to that question, in part by my description of what's a kind of ethnic nationalism. So think about, there are two immediate ways I see parallels to our moment. One is that the appeal to the ancestors is inclusive of those with genealogical ties, but exclusive of others. And it can resemble a kind of ethnic nationalism that we see has inspired wars around the globe and closes people off to newcomers and diversity. Certainly, Jefferson's "we hold these truths to be self-evident" is far more wide-reaching than "you owe it to your ancestors." So that's one. But a second problem is that from the Stamp Act protests on, many patriots laid out strong arguments why British taxation without representation is slavery. And some of them laid out arguments for resistance that would be controversial. In the boycotts of British goods as an attempt to use economic pressure to get Britain in Parliament to change its policies, people in Massachusetts also tried to change policies. But there's not a lot of free space for unfettered public debate. People who were ready to import goods despite the boycotts in Boston could be tarred and feathered or carted through the town. Now, if you were to say, how free was speech in the decade leading up to the revolution? Actually, it was incredibly free for people who become patriots. Not so much for people who dissented. And so one of the things you could worry about is, were we rushed into a revolution? Or were the patriots right? It's certainly the case when you look at the provincial Congress and the various resolutions it passed. that Britain was indeed severely infringing upon self-government in Massachusetts with the Massachusetts Government Act. It would have been almost impossible, other than in a general legislative session, for communities to protest British policies. Yes, you could elect a representative to the House in Boston, but the governor might decide to just dissolve the House and you weren't going to meet. And then it would be against the law to gather on your own to protest. So there was not much room for a voice of independent criticism. And if you were going to protest British policies in the legislature, you would have to frame a humble petition to the crown. And if the king turned it down, live with it. So at one and the same time, we've always had a problem understanding the American Revolution. Was it simply a clear and obvious move by Britain to deny people in Massachusetts and elsewhere the rights of self-government? Would they have to accept forever being second-class subjects of the king and parliament? But we're not living in a world that was democratic and egalitarian. In the world that they lived in, was this so bad? The British action to end the House of Representatives' election of the council was not unprecedented. That was the norm in every royal colony. The king appointed the council. So if we were to think about the coming of the revolution in British policy in the context of the 18th century, not of what the revolution came to mean, then maybe you would be a lot more concerned about the harassing of loyalists who had a hard time making their case. And if you were to think to yourself, how many people had to die to make Samuel Adams' vision come true? Maybe you would pause again, especially since a great many of those people fighting for liberty were slaveholders. Or, most importantly, had their eyes out on the lands of native peoples. And one of the major objections that the people, especially in Virginia, had to British policy was that the proclamation line was drawn in 1763, beyond which the white subjects of England couldn't go and infringe on Indian lands. So from this point of view, you might say, in expanding America across the continent, which nobody imagined in the beginning of the revolution, would become the outcome in ways that would be destructive for native peoples. And actually, in the end, enable the expansion of the kingdom of slavery. So anybody happy about the American Revolution now that I've complicated? You're going to go out on April 19th and boo the Acton Minutemen? How many of you want to, anybody encouraged to do that? They do have muskets.
Do we have additional questions?
There's one back there. Okay.
Let's see, make sure that we can hear.
How does Massachusetts' religious past and like revolutionary past relate to its modern day views and like how it is now?
How do ideas of liberty or equality then compare to now?
Yeah.
Very good question. We might take it up this way. The people of Massachusetts said that Britain wanted to reduce them. Actually, the white patriots everywhere said Britain wanted to reduce them to absolute slavery. And you gotta laugh when you're hearing that from Virginians and South Carolinians. Like, what? But what they meant was taxes to which you didn't consent were denying you the fruits of your own labor, right? You produce something, you exchange it in the market, you get money, it's yours, you think you earned it, fruits of your labor. And then suddenly, Britain comes and says, sorry, we'll take a good chunk of that. But who was denied the fruits of their labor more than the enslaved? But because they enslaved people, the white colonists had a pretty good idea of what slavery meant. And now today, we have people who are against taxes levied by governments they elect, who will still make the argument that taxation is a form of slavery. Key there is, but who elected whom? By what rights? The meanings of liberty and equality before the revolution have to be understood after it in the context of constitutions and the rule of law. Constitutions set the framework for the exercise of liberty and for the securing of equal rights in the common good. So I would say you've got to change the framework. But in addition, your question is really a good one because I was talking about a hierarchical society. Mary Fuhrer was lecturing about a hierarchical society. What does liberty mean in a society of ranks and orders, of hierarchies of upper and lower classes? That's, but to translate it and answer the question, how is this connected today? What does liberty and equality mean in a new gilded age, which billionaires have the ability to buy out all the TV time for election ads, so that unequal power is exercised both in the 18th century and in the 21st century, albeit in different frameworks. And so then the question becomes, do we need a new American Revolution, but a constitutional and legal one? I'll leave that to all of you. Do I address your question? Okay. Yeah, one last question.
Just a quick question, I hope. Given the reluctance of Acton and Concord in sort of this outer ring here to get involved before 1774, how much of that was, this is a Boston problem, not a problem out here? I mean, if I live in Plymouth or I live in Salem, Boston Harbor's blockaded, but those harbors aren't. So if I need to, I can sneak out. If I live in Acton, well, is it easier to trade in Boston? Probably, but I can still get my stuff to Salem, or it may be a pain in the tuchus, but I can get it out to New York. Those sorts of things. So how much of that reluctance to make a statement before that is, that's a Boston problem?
I think some of that may be true. but not all. One of the things I didn't talk about for time is that Concord, particularly, was a county seat. It was a market center. Courts regularly met there. People came to trade. And it attracted a number of great men, great in the sense of they had royal appointments. It was a center for where the militias would gather, the county regiment. And a lot of the people who held those appointments were named by the royal governor in the name of the crown. And they tended to identify with the expanding British Empire. Most of the men in Concord who enslaved men and women of color held appointments from the crown. In addition, they speculated in Western lands, in New Hampshire and Western Massachusetts. That if you're going to speculate in lands and sell off lands for new townships, you're looking forward to the growth of Massachusetts and of the British Empire. You're not looking to war, you're looking to peace. And in so doing, you are building out your networks. And these people are John Cumming of Concord, who got a big land grant. His is the house opposite and the Rotary, the old colonial dilapidated house. That was his great country house. And he got the land grant for what's now Cummington, Massachusetts. So these were people who had, their connections all over the place. They identified with the British Empire, even as at the same time they were meant to represent their neighbors. There was incredible tension there. Some became loyalists. Others, for the longest time, tried to delay. Those of you who've been on a committee, if you're named to be on a chair of committee, but you don't really like the proposals, what do? Yeah? You stall. You say, oh, we need another month to look this over. And then, gee, I'm sorry, can't make the next meeting. And what I think was happening a lot, people were stalling and stalling. So, that's really helpful that you're for destroying the tea 3 months after the tea was destroyed. Whereas Lexington actually gathered up all the tea in town and burned it before the tea got dumped off of Griffin's Wharf. So you got to, way to study the revolution is ask, when did things happen? Were people delaying? Acton accepted a report on the Tea Act at town meeting, but never recorded the report in the town meeting minutes. Why? Did this clerk have writer's cramp? Or something else going on? So anyway, so broadly, I think, the notable men of Concord had a tension between their identification with the local community and their would-be identification with the broader empire. But when Britain basically said, forget about it, you will remain forever second-class subjects of this empire, most of them, even if they didn't want to lead a rebellion, stayed. So, and you have stayed attentively, albeit quietly, long enough. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to sign books if any of you would like.
Now, listen carefully. All of the students are going to gently come up here in a moment in order to take a picture with you. Okay, we're going to commandeer you. Books are available in the back. You see Sharon standing up. She was the first question about the book. You might ask her about it.